A shift is happening. The world is now more multifaceted and unpredictable than it has ever been. Leaders face a choice as to how to respond. What happens next matters. It matters for yourself, colleagues, your parents, your children, your future grandchildren, and for your living grandparents. What is the next act for your leadership?
Leadership is changing. At Shift Unlimited, our purpose is to work with senior leaders as you shift the way you connect with yourselves, others, and the wider world. Undertaking a transformation of the self through reflection, inquiry, disruption, and experimentation. This podcast channel is focused on this as we believe your shift is unlimited.
Hello and welcome, everyone. The purpose of this podcast is to explore the highs and lows of behaviour change, critically evaluating what it takes to make change stick. Today, we will delve into innovative and evidence-based strategies for behaviour change. So the outcome that we're seeking is a better understanding of the research and the theories that are out there and what you can do to really make change stick. Today, we have special guests joining us. So Kylie and I have Jeanette with us today. Jeanette is a coaching psychologist and she's worked in the prison service, education, and with the private sector. Jeanette coaches professionals experiencing procrastination and burnout to first recalibrate, achieve clarity on their presenting issues, reformulate their goals, and make necessary behavioural change to meet their goals. Looking at the science, though, behind behaviour change is valuable because it helps us understand why we behave the way we do and how to make positive change. By studying factors like psychology, social influences, environment, we can create effective strategies to encourage healthier habits, better learning, and personal growth. The critical evaluation in our discussion today showcases methods of behaviour change that are based on solid evidence, making them much more likely to work and be sustainable. Before we dive into all of this, though, Jeanette, can you tell us a little bit more about who you are and what brought you to the world of behavioural change?
Yes, thank you for having me. So as you said, I'm a coaching psychologist, currently working one-to-one and in groups. But my actual journey into behaviour change started when I was working for the prison service. And in particularly, what I was doing then was facilitating offender behaviour programmes. And this was really my first introduction to behaviour change in action. And then since then, I've applied it to education, to private practice. And for me, I just love connecting those dots between the empirical psychological research and then real world behaviour. So my focus of my work within custody, as well as delivering programmes and then being head of treatment management, was also conducting some research. And so one of the early pieces of research that I did was on two areas. So whether or not violent offences and non-violent offences had a difference in how behaviour was shown in prison. So, for example, the prison was particularly interested in if somebody came into prison with a violent offence, did they display more negative behaviour, which resulted in more what we call adjudications. So for anybody who's not familiar with the prison service and terminology, adjudications refer to kind of like mini trials. So in this situation, an offender can be found guilty or not guilty for a certain behaviour whilst in custody, which can then result in a consequence like a punishment. So this could be loss of earnings, loss of privileges, even extra days added onto their sentence. So in that piece of research, I found that there was actually no difference as to whether an offender came into custody with a violent offence or a non-violent offence and their behaviour whilst in custody. But a second area of research that I did was looking at the impact of cognitive behavioural programmes, so programmes based on scientific empirical research in psychology. And with this was looking at if offenders attended cognitive behavioural programmes, was their behaviour better in custody, i.e. did they get less adjudications? The outcome was that offenders who attended cognitive behavioural programmes had less adjudications. So this really did lay the foundation for me in terms of how I understand and apply behavioural change moving forward into my current practice.
Such an interesting topic, behavior change. We live in this VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world. And there's that old saying of if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. And even just hearing you speak now, Jeanette, that's no longer true. Mel and I have been saying this for a while, that saying can no longer be true, because we'll just be very lucky to get what we've always got, because we can't rely on yesterday's strategies in order to be successful today. We're living in a time of such unprecedented change, and change is the only constant. So learning how to make change stick in this environment that we're living in right now is important for all of us, important for all the leaders and the coaches that listen to this podcast to have an interest in.
And you talked about the fact that if you always done what you've always done, you won't necessarily get it. How has your approach to behaviour changed over time, Kylie?
Well, early days of my study, I did some research as well. It's a long time ago now, and it was based on the Pavlovian conditioning response. And some of you may already know about the Pavlovian conditioning response. It's also called classical conditioning. It's a learning process discovered by a psychologist called Ivan Pavlov, and it involves creating an association between a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus to get a conditioned response. His research involved a dog, a bowl of food, and a bell. So he had a dog, and he would ring a bell and place a bowl of food in front of the dog, and the dog would salivate because the bowl of food is in front of the dog, and food creates that salivation response. But at the same time, he was ringing this bell. And so he would continue to ring the bell when he placed the food in front of the dog. And over time, the dog was creating an associated conditioned response to the bell. So Pavlov then rang the bell but didn't put the food in front of the dog, and the dog would salivate. And so this theory I did some research on a long time ago, which was one of the first pieces of research done in humans around this classical conditioning. And it showed that we too have this Pavlovian response, that we can create these stimulus response associations ourselves. And so behavior change is changing those responses, because sometimes those responses are simply unhelpful. And so how has it evolved and changed over time? I still believe that stimulus response conditioning does exist, and we do exhibit that in our lives and in our body. But the work that you and I do, Mel, with our coaching brings in a multidisciplinary approach. It includes looking at the person as a whole being. We often talk about it's who you are drives what you do, rather than what you do driving who you are. So all of these aspects that develop the sense of self influence our behavior.
And we're talking about behaviour change and that the only constant is change. What do you think the common barriers to behaviour change are, and how can they be overcome?
Yeah, I think in terms of my research, unclear goals and lack of personal relevance can be a significant factor in behaviour change. So, for example, if I refer back to my custody research, which, like yours, Kylie, was many, many years ago, but some of the goals were to stop offending or to stop drugs. And in the day to day, that maybe didn't mean very much to the offenders in that moment. And so, similarly with clients now, we have to bring these goals closer. So, we have to make them more real time, more meaningful, more values driven in order to evoke change. So, the coaching that we can do kind of helps anchor these goals to our identity and to our strengths, making them feel much more doable and meaningful in the now, rather than the concept of, well, one day or when that happens, I'll address that goal.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess there's also if it's to not do something, it leaves a vacuum as well, doesn't it? Of, well, what do I do instead if I'm not doing that?
Yeah, and it's very deficit based.
Yeah, absolutely. It's painful. What are some of the examples of workplace behaviours that are conditioned responses that are unhelpful, would you say, Kylie?
Well, in our work, we tend to see some of these ones: public speaking anxiety, so someone who feels levels of anxiety from mild to intense when they're presenting, either presenting in a meeting or presenting to large audiences. So that can become a conditioned response where just the idea of presenting can create this anxiety even long before you are standing up presenting. We've seen other examples of feedback. In our work, Mel, you and I are always advocating regular feedback and creating a feedback culture. But a person who may have received some feedback previously that really hurt them, and a negative feeling around it, can get anxious about performance reviews. And so even before they have the performance review, they're feeling this anxiety, or even before they have a feedback conversation, they're feeling these negative, difficult feelings to feel because they've created a conditioned response around feedback and anxiety. Deadlines, a lot of the businesses and leaders that we work with are juggling so many things right now, and a very big workload with deadlines that come into play. And someone who feels high levels of stress during those environments will create a high level of stress just thinking about it, not even necessarily being in that space themselves. Conflict, you and I talk about conflict as well. So if someone has a negative experience during a conflict with a colleague, then they may associate that colleague with that negative experience. So even just seeing that colleague walk down the hall or around the office can create that level of ill feeling or anxiety in the body. So that's just some of the unhealthy conditioned responses that we see in our work with coaching.
Yeah, as you talk about that now, it does sound very like that research you were doing, that Pavlovian responses. Well, what techniques can be used then to reinforce new behaviours, given there can be these things going on in the workplace and just more generally?
Yeah, I think that comes down to that reflection and real time application. So even in my previous prison work and now in my current coaching psychology, it's really not just about introducing the tools to the clients. It's about really encouraging and facilitating that client to practice them and then reflect upon what worked, what didn't work so well, and why not. And then they can bring that to the next session. So they can have their own in between session work on practicing them in real time. So, for example, introducing a client to Ellis's ABCD model. So it may be that they need some help in real time to challenge some kind of cognitive distortion that they were having about an event that took place. And then they can actually work through the elements of the ABCDE themselves and then reflect in real time what was the thought that they were having, what then led to a certain behavior. And then that can be brought, into the session. Or for a client, for example, struggling with transition, I might introduce them to the insight model, whereby they can really think about their resourcing themselves, working with their strengths. What strengths did they apply to a previous challenge that they can now bring into this current situation, this new situation? So it really does come down to real-time application to build that sense of self-efficacy and sustainability of a behaviour.
Those models sound
Yeah.
really interesting. So that's the Ellis ABCDE model and Insight Enhancing Transition Resilience. So we will share those details in the show notes. And you're talking about practicing things real time. What role does habit formation play in maintaining this behavioural change, Kylie?
It's critical. Habit formation is critical to maintain behavior change. If we just go back to classical conditioning for a moment, this conditioned response of ringing the bell and the dog salivating, it can be extinguished. So if the bell rings and over a long period of time there's no food coming, the dog's just going to stop salivating and realizing there's no food. So the association between the bell and the food is broken, and it's called extinction. Following extinction, we can have two things that can happen. One is spontaneous recovery, which is spontaneous recovery, just like the name says, it refers to the sudden reappearance of something that was previously extinguished. So this old habit can spontaneously recover. And we also have reacquisition. And reacquisition is the relearning of this old habit and it comes back into play again. And if those, the research shows that those two things, spontaneous recovery and reacquisition, they are real, they do happen. And if they are real and they do happen, then habit formation is absolutely critical in maintaining any behavior change. That repetition establishes the new neural pathways that we need in order to lean forwards into the new ways of being rather than leaning backwards into these old habits that we no longer want.
We're talking about creating new habits, but you're talking about things coming back potentially as well. And so it's like a constant focus. What about feelings of self-worth? How are they when it comes to making behavioural change really stick?
Yeah, well, I think feelings of self-worth are pivotal because low self-worth can often hold people back. And I've seen this, with many different clients going back to custody when they feel like that somebody has been written off from society, their goals shrink. They don't feel that they are worthy of having such goals. So it creates this disconnect. So I think in terms of self-worth, if low self-worth means that goals shrink, high self-worth can mean that our goals grow, that we actually feel able, capable, worthy of having such goals. And so coaching, I think, builds this sense of self-worth by spotlighting with a client their progress, their strengths, and their choice, their autonomy, and builds their self-efficacy. So it's really about helping people believe that they're worth the effort. I always remember a beautiful pictorial display of when there's two stick figures, and one stick figure, if you're focusing on the problem and feeling like you're not able to solve this problem, the problem gets bigger. And I think coaching really highlights that when you focus on the person and you help that person grow their sense of self-worth and self-efficacy, they themselves grow, in which case the problem becomes smaller and therefore they're able to feel that they can action a behaviour that will meet that goal.
Okay, so that self-worth is really important, and yet at the same time the external coaching to reinforce this good progress seems really important. So Kylie, do external rewards like this really work?
External rewards can work, yes, if they're significant enough, so if they mean something enough. But I wouldn't rely on external rewards alone, though. Just, based on what Jeanette was saying, like if someone has a low sense of self-worth, but you're relying solely on external rewards, then take the rewards away, and their low self-worth isn't enough for them to lean forwards into their belief around their ability to change. So, yes, if they're significant enough, and yes, if they're paired with this high sense of self-worth and purpose and values. I think also that the way organizations are set up and the systems they've got around organizations do matter as well. You know, Mel, what are your thoughts on that in terms of the ways organizational practices and policies can support or obstruct behavior change?
There's so many factors, aren't they, that enable and support behavioural change and good behaviour and organisational practices. We've heard many leaders say if someone's committed enough to the change, then the organisational practice or policy shouldn't get in the way. And yet we found time and time again it does. If an organisation is advocating one type of behaviour and then they're rewarding something different, so they're advocating spending time with your people and being very client focused, and they only reward you based on sales, then it undermines the ability to make change happen. So those environmental factors, it seems like all those make a difference. Environmental, having people there to support you, and then really wanting it yourself, they all seem to be really important factors that combine to enable success, I would say. How about the individual sense of purpose and values then? How much does that influence behaviour change?
Yeah, I see. I think purpose and values is everything when it comes to behaviour change. If you think of it, that it gives us our sense of why. So that, for example, when I'm working with a client, part of my work will have the client literally identify and then name their values. And then with that, it's starting to build that sense of identity and also that awareness of where perhaps their behaviour is not aligning with their values. So quite often I will do some values-based work, for example, from Harris and ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, where we really look at their values and how much their behaviour is aligning. So for example, out of 10 in different domains of their life. And this really does shine that spotlight and give an impetus to how much of their behaviour is not in alignment with that particular value. And if that value is a deep sense of their purpose and identity, they can start to understand how that's why they're feeling maybe incongruent on a day-to-day basis. So by shifting it to, right, how can I live in alignment with my values? It really helps the client to kind of shift that sense of resilience and direction for any future behaviours that they do.
That makes sense. And what about reflection and mindfulness? Because they're talked about quite a lot today as being a really important thing in play, particularly in the workplace.
RIDE practices are, they put reflection right at the front of leadership practices for modern leadership today. Elizabeth Gilbert wrote and said that you cannot see your reflection in running water. So to be still is needed in order for reflection, and that's where the mindfulness comes in. And when we're still, we can reflect, we can look at ourselves, we do a deeper self-inquiry on how was I, how did I show up today, how was my behavior, did I lean forwards into the ways that I want to show up, did I fall backwards into old ways of being. We talk about how you do one thing is how you do everything, and reflection is just a beautiful way of reflecting on self at the end of the day, at the end of a week. And Mel, you and I would say it's really important, reflection and mindfulness, for leaning into behavior change.
Yeah, such a rich topic. There's so much we could be exploring in this area. And it's been fabulous having you as our guest today, Jeanette, to talk and share some of your knowledge from Kylie and I work predominantly in sport and in organisations. So hearing about your work in the prison service and some of those factors is adding an extra dimension to it. So thank you for joining us today. If you do have any questions or you'd like to get in touch about behavioural change, please do either contact us on Instagram or you can contact us through this podcast series. We hope you join us again soon, and thank you very much for your time today.